Today we're covering the U.S. and Latin America. Our essential question, what actions did the U.S. take to achieve its goals in Latin America? So first we'll start with Puerto Rico. You know that after the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico was one of the territories that we got control of. So Puerto Rico is under U.S. military control. In 1900, the Foraker Act is passed, establishing a government in Puerto Rico. This government was based on the U.S. government. The U.S. president chooses the governor and part of the legislature. The other part of the legislature is decided upon by Puerto Rican residents, and they did not have the same rights as U.S. citizens. Today, Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States and still do not have the same rights as U.S. citizens because they're a territory. So they don't have representation in Congress. They do not have electors for the presidential election, though they can compete in the primary, and they have a non-voting member within Congress. But still, they do not have the same voice in the United States government as citizens of states do. So Cuba. You remember that prior to us intervening in the Spanish-American War, we passed the Teller Amendment, which said that we would not annex Cuba. So we followed through on the Teller Amendment. Cuba, we never officially annexed. They are technically independent. However, our troops stay in Cuba for about 5 years after the end of the war. Basically, we are treating them as an occupied nation. And in order to get our troops to leave, the United States forces Cuba to pass the Platt Amendment. All right, so they passed the Platt Amendment to get U.S. troops to leave their country. And the Platt Amendment makes Cuba a protectorate of the United States. So although they're technically independent, the Platt Amendment restricts the rights of Cubans. It outlines certain things that the Cuban government can't do. They weren't allowed to sign treaties alone because we didn't want them to enter into an alliance that could be dangerous to Cuba. We said that they must lease naval stations to the United States. That's how we gained control of Guantanamo Bay, if you're familiar with Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And also it said that the U.S. had the right to intervene if anything was happening in Cuba that we thought threatened their independence or threatened their safety, that we could send U.S. troops down to Cuba at any time. So Cubans obviously disliked the Platt Amendment because they wanted full independence, and the Platt Amendment does not allow that. It puts a lot of restrictions on the Cuban government. The Platt Amendment is going to stay in place until 1934. So about 3 decades, the Platt Amendment is outlining Cuban rights and the U.S. government's relations with Cuba. All right, you probably heard me mention the big stick, or you saw it in the president's videos. Big stick diplomacy was Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy. All right, he was known for the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. So the speak softly part means to use diplomacy, right, to talk out issues with other nations, but be ready to back it up with force. That's the big stick. What was America's big stick during this time? What part of the military had we built up? That's right, the military. Not the military, the Navy. So, big stick diplomacy depends on a strong military to achieve America's goals, and Teddy Roosevelt was not going to shy away from using the military to accomplish our goals in Latin America. How do you think Latin American countries feel about big stick diplomacy? Yeah, most are not a fan of the United States basically bullying them around, right? We went on that goodwill tour with our Great White Fleet, basically intimidating people into doing what we wanted under the force of threat. So the big stick diplomacy helps us gain control of the Panama Canal, enables us to build the Panama Canal. If you are not aware, a canal is a man-made waterway, and the U.S. wanted to build one through Panama to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Prior to the Panama Canal being built, if you wanted to go from the east coast to the west coast of the United States, you had to go all the way around South America. All right, that was like 12,000 miles. We wanted a shorter way to be able to move our naval fleet from one coast to the other. It was a matter of national security for us, as well as making trade faster and easier. So, there were several places that we looked at to build this canal, but Panama is the slimmest part of Central America. We decided on Panama, but there was a problem. Panama was not an independent country. They were part of Colombia. We offered Colombia a certain amount of money to build the canal, but they were holding out for more money, which really ticked off Teddy Roosevelt. So instead of giving Colombia more money, instead we helped Panamanian rebels overthrow the Colombian government and gain independence. So once Panama was an independent nation, we were able to get the Panama Canal for the price that we wanted. So we paid $10 million up front for the canal zone, plus $250,000 of annual rent for us to be in control of the Panama Canal. We continued paying that rent for decades, and it was finally in the 90s that we hand over control of the Panama Canal back to Panama. So this was a complicated process, but honestly, it was the easiest part of the whole deal. Building a canal is no small feat, and the Panama Canal is one of the greatest engineering feats in the history of the world. Over 35,000 workers helped to dig and build the canal. It was dangerous and hard work. Over 5,600 workers ended up dying from tropical diseases in the area and also accidents doing this dangerous work. The Panama Canal was being built for over a decade, finally opens in 1914, with a total cost of $345 million. It cost us to build the Panama Canal. If you are interested in the engineering behind the Panama Canal, I encourage you to look up some YouTube videos. It's really interesting how we build the lock system to move the ships across. It really is an amazing thing that we did. So the Monroe Doctrine, as we've discussed, was issued way back in the 1820s. But until the early 1900s, we didn't really have the power to back it up. Now we do, that power being the U.S. Navy, our strong military. So President Theodore Roosevelt updates the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine makes the U.S. a police power in Latin America. So basically gives us the powers of a police officer. All right, it puts us in control of these Latin American countries. There are a couple of reasons why. Many Latin American countries had debts that they couldn't repay. Europe started, sniffing around these countries, trying to get the debts that were owed to them paid. So we update the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary to keep European powers from intervening in the Western Hemisphere. However, Latin American countries were not thankful for the Roosevelt Corollary. They actually hated this because it did put them in like a second place position to the United States. You know, the thought of Latin American countries is we can police ourselves. Thanks. We don't really need you looking over our shoulder constantly, breathing down our neck. So this does hurt our relations with Latin America, along with the big stick diplomacy. Relations between the U.S. and Latin America during this time are not great. Teddy's successors take on a different type of foreign policy while they are president. William Howard Taft's foreign policy was called dollar diplomacy. It was based on investing money in Latin American countries to improve relations, but also using the military when necessary to intervene in those countries. And Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy was called moral diplomacy. Basically, Woodrow Wilson stated that he would not use force to assert U.S. influence. Instead, he was going to focus on promoting human rights, dealing only with countries that had like democratic governments, not negotiating with leaders that had like dictatorships in Latin America. Despite his good intentions and his idealism with moral diplomacy, Wilson still used the military to get his way. In fact, he used the military to intervene in Latin America more so than even Teddy Roosevelt did. So during this time, we are heavily involved in Latin American affairs, basically carrying out our position as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere that the Monroe Doctrine put forward almost 100 years prior.